prestigious panel. This panel will be covering protecting religious minorities, refugees, migrants, political human rights, and human challenges. Now, there are three questions that our panelists have been asked to respond to, and I'd like to share those with you now. The first one is, what are current global trends regarding refugees, migrants, and religious minorities? And to please provide specific examples. Do refugees and migrants constitute a threat to the stability of destination countries, or do they rather enrich our culture and stability? And the third question is, how can various societal actors enhance tolerance, respect, and non-discrimination of refugees, migrants, and religious minorities locally and globally? These are very, very key questions, and they've been asked to respond in a short period of time. And I do realize that it is a short period of time, but our time is limited, and we do want to hear from everyone and have possibly the opportunity to ask questions. So I would respectfully ask our panelists to keep to time. I'd like to welcome Dr. Mohamed Abu Nimer, who's the Senior Advisor at KAICIID and Dialogue Center. Please begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Morning. Assalamu alaikum. I'm actually going to talk about the second and the third question rather than the general trend with a focus on Europe. However, allow me to just start by saying that we all assume and agree that providing the basic humanitarian relief and basic living condition for these three vulnerable groups, refugees, migrant, and religious minority, is the first step of priority, and it is a luxury to talk about religious and political rights when refugee migrants are denied the basic human rights, when they are caged into barbed wires around the borders in Europe or outside of Europe as well. It's also a luxury to talk about this without mentioning the fact that there are numerous governments until now who refuse to receive and admit refugees who are in a crisis and trapped in different camps around the world, especially in the Middle East area. Rather than focusing on these challenges and the state of affairs in various parts of the world, I would like to focus on the factors that affect the process of enhancing the protection of political rights, namely the integration of migrant and religious minority and refugees in Europe. One of the main issues is the root causes for this growing right-wing and populist movement against the refugees and religious minority in the European context. The first is really the secular infrastructure and culture of European governmental institutions that impedes integration in general, and even more essentially the engagement with religious groups and religious identity. The notion and the importance, despite the fact that religion can play an important role in the healing process and as well as in the refugees, we continue to see stigmatization and the prejudice against religious minority. We see the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and the latest report of the Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe have indicated that, with many testimonies from both of these communities about the rise in this. And in my analysis, this strong secular culture that negates and alienates religious identity in this context have paved the way for what we call the politics of fear and campaigns against refugees and migrants, and using them as an element of fear in the election campaigns by certain political leaders. And unfortunately, they found a listening ear or fertile soil for this. There is no doubt that the legislative aspect is required in the European institution on the level of policy to prevent seeing the headscarf of a Muslim woman or any religious symbol for Jews, Buddhists, Hindus as a threat to the European lifestyle. That component, the threat to the European lifestyle, have been the core, and values have been the core, one of the core points that are made, and the politics of fear is based on that. The notion of diversity in Europe does not include, in the policy level, does not include the integration of religion in the different institutions as well. But again, we can spend more time in the diagnosis of this. Let me just move to the reality of what can we do or what can be done on the policy level. On the policy level, we're looking at the need to institutionally engage ethnic minority, religious group, migrant, and refugees through platforms, joint platforms, and also to go beyond the symbolic engagement of inviting one sheikh or one priest or one rabbi, and also move beyond having one person in the entire agency of EU or OSCE or even the United Nations to have only one person or two persons dealing with that. That's not sustainable, and that's not really systematic. So we need to call and advocate for the creation of this systematic platform to do that. The second point is really the engagement with migrant and refugees need to be based on what we call inside out rather than outside in. Outside in meaning we decide for them their representation, we force them to be united rather than listen from the inside and be able to work from the inside out and gain access to these communities as well. The last point on the institutional level, how can we expect in a European context people not to be afraid of religion when religious literacy is not introduced in the formal education system as well. A child can grow in their entire education life and career and not really learn about Islam, Judaism, or Christianity. So the concept of religious identity is outside of that part. The final point, we've been talking about refugees and migrant as survivor and victim, but there are also responsibility. 2 points of responsibility that migrant and those vulnerable community would be helpful to work on is really to take clear stand against voices who call for religious purity and as a result encourage ethnic and religious enclave and not really interact with the other minority groups. The second point, the need to engage with solidarity and build alliance within other groups who are marginalized. The security of the refugees and the migrant as well the religious minority can be fairly enhanced by building coalitions with anti-racist, anti-bigots, with the environmental movement, with many other movements, rather than working alone on one dimension of religion. We know from the American experience after 9/11, the main security of these groups on the ground comes from building those internal alliance. My final point, this conference and many conferences that I go to, and believe me, I go to many of them, unfortunately, is that we talk about symptoms rather than root causes. We all know and aware that the root causes for migrant and refugees, no one of them would like to leave their home, not the Palestinian or Syrian or Somali or Afghani or Libyan or Tunisian or Kashmiri or Filipino or Burmese and others. No one would like to leave their home and travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles to be a refugee. They are running away from and risking their life because of injustice, bad governance, corruption, freedom of expression, lack of economic development, and the free market policy that left masses in poverty. And on top of all of this, we in the European context and the American one continue to produce arm and weapon and sell it to their government. Without us dealing with those root causes, we will continue to basically try to treat the symptoms of refugees leaving Nigeria and Africa and Middle East, and that's really not waste of energy or resources, but really endless cycle that will not produce much effect. We need to talk about those policies that continue to produce governments and regimes that generate these waves of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. NIMER, for outlining for us about how it's luxurious to talk about religious rights when their basic human rights are being abused. But you've also very, very eloquently, I think, intertwined how those basic human rights are being abused through prejudice against religion. So thank you. Could I now turn to Ms. Hajar Al-KADDO? You'll have to say it for me properly. We've known each other for years, I don't know. Anyway, she's from the Forum of European Muslims, Youth and Student Organizations. Thank you, Hajar.
Thank you, Bonnie. We'll talk about my surname later. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. Shalom. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm always the youth representative sitting here, so I'm going to try and make this as youthful as possible without being too cynical or depressing. Thank you, Madam Chair, again, distinguished guests. It's a really great honor to be here amongst you representing Muslim youth in Europe. Sometimes I actually wonder what motivates us to use the word or terms refugees and migrants when we speak about arrival of people on the shores of Europe, since we only really heard about it between 2015 and 2016. And it seems in such a short amount of time that these issues and challenges have mysteriously gone away or disappeared from the media. And miraculously, we've solved all of the issues, yet in reality, Europe hasn't really found any real solutions, sadly. A bit of pessimism there from the youth. We've invested in detention centers, we have put up borders, we have found a few small positive actions and expectations to these. But unfortunately, as Dr. Abu Nimer has already pointed out, it's only religious minorities are only talked about, or migrants and refugees, when populist politicians or the media outlets wish to promote their own agendas. Where does this really leave us? Where does it leave young people? And that's something I want to ask. The recent attacks, obviously, in the past month have been devastating. I, for one, have been lost for words, sincerely, and I'm not usually lost for words. Really, we are living in a very, very difficult time. I'm constantly asking myself as a young humanitarian and an interfaith, hopefully worker and future leader, what are we actually doing wrong? Why are we being attacked? And I say we as a Muslim, as a woman, as a young person, and why are we being attacked? For wanting to be part of our societies, for wanting to protect religious freedoms and the freedoms of all and the freedoms of minorities. And we do want to adhere to the values in our own communities. I guess our world functions not in spite of, but because of migration, international agreements that we've heard about, communications and so much more. Doesn't this really enrich us as communities, and doesn't it enrich our economies? Funnily enough, The Economist, a centre-right-wing specialist UK media publication, called for the welcoming of more migrants for economic reasons. Indeed, that really does show that we don't only welcome refugees for one thing, but for another, and we can use it to our advantage. I want to say millions of young people of migrant origins came to Europe, making valuable cultural contributions, social contributions, political and economic, every single day, making Europe a dynamic, multicultural and innovative continent in the world today. This is one of the secrets behind Europe's success. Policymakers need to be really frank and open with their populations. They need to be courageous. We need to see courage in our leaders, because the populist and far-right groups, as we've heard from the panel before and since yesterday, are gaining traction in Europe today, partly because our leaders are not facing up to this false discourse. And in some cases, they're stealing this discourse in order to gain votes in Europe. So we need to see more principled, real leadership. And honestly, we need to see youth leadership more than ever. To quote one of my really super young and upcoming colleagues, young people have the power to make Europe a better place by choosing diversity over discrimination, integration over isolation, and this can only be done when you bring young people to the decision-making table. It's really easy for me to say this and to talk about this, honestly. I'm always here, I'm always sitting at these tables since 2015, and thank you for the opportunity, but sincerely, where are the other religious youth leaders? Where is our representation? One way FEMISO, who are the Forum of European Muslim Youth and Student Organizations, who represent over 140,000 Muslim youth. I don't say we represent everybody, but we represent a lot of young people. across 23 countries are encouraging young people to now work within the democratic system by voting in this year's European elections. Ensuring young people's voices count in elections is the first step to having them counted as active citizens in their Europe, because truly it is our Europe. Because nobody else will take us, quite frankly, either. With young people calling for climate change protests erupting around the world from a really young voice. A young voice has erupted all of this climate change discussion and the ripple of change we have seen apparent and endorsed by young people. In reality, the protection of vulnerable groups begins with each one of us. We all know this. We keep saying it. We preach it in our mosques, in our churches, in our synagogues. But really, what are we doing? Are we just sitting here yet again talking and writing documents with all my respect, obviously? As long as good people allow bad things to happen around them, their society's international norms will not provide any real guarantees. We have seen this in the heartfelt initiatives, though, where people have mobilized and organized and protected rights of those the most vulnerable, like those amazing people who are welcoming refugees or integrating them and showing how they can contribute to society. These initiatives send important messages to our policymakers, that if they're not willing to take on the leadership, actually, ordinary people will step up and do it themselves. And I think that young people are beginning to see that light. We must take care of our youth sincerely, as we're going to run the world tomorrow. We don't know where the rest of you are going to be. And we need to ensure that we're not teaching them that war and discrimination is okay, because that is what we're teaching. I guess a few solutions, and I think this has already been reiterated a couple of times: human rights education in our religious education systems. That's what we need to see. I believe training and toolkits, actually, useful toolkits that we can use with positive messaging is really important. My time is up, and I'm almost finished, I promise. Religious leadership needs to be more gender balanced. I mean, it's great to see, panels that are balanced, but I don't see any women Muslim leaders or women leaders in other faiths, other than Bonnie, obviously. And hopefully the next generation will take on these roles. We need to empower think tanks, because they're the ones who are, and are doing most of the incredible research work, and youth organizations. I think there's another thing that I would like to really encourage, is that when we have interfaith joint actions led by young people, I'd like to see our religious leadership show up. I'd like to see them listen. I'd like to see them learn from us in our environments, because we can't always, and we don't always have the privilege to come into these environments to be heard. We would like you to come to us and to sit in our gatherings. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Hoda. Thank you Hajar. Thank you so much. You outlined for us that the refugee crisis has not been solved, even though it's gone out of the attention of the news, and the real frustration at the lack of solutions, particularly among the younger generation, and the frustration of a lack of representation. So thank you for providing that voice for us. I'd now like to welcome the Reverend Grace Chung Lee, who's president of the Vision for a New Civilization. Thank you.
I just want to provide a little different angle, look at the ethical and moral perspective on the global issue today. We are living in a new world with a new reality, but it requires humanity to change and adopt a new way of living together with others, and in this multicultural and multi-religious context, with other religious minority, refugees, and migrants. Yet many people did not learn and transform themselves to live together and how to peacefully coexist with others. Thus, it is critical to address the root causes of hate speech and hate crime in order to protect religious minorities, refugees, and migrants. It is based on human greed and hatred and delusion expressed as a destructive cruelty. Thus, we are called to examine human behavior, attitudes, belief, as well as your human minds and heart. So today's too much emphasis on material and external values generates more greed to focus on self-interest, hatred in the mind, produce hate crime and hate speech against these minority and vulnerable groups. So we must practice moral and ethical and spiritual values, prevent hatred and bias and prejudice toward the religious minority in our society. We need a new vision. We need a new thinking and new approaches to tackle these profound problems really causing whole humanity, because it's hurting themselves and by hurting others. Also, it's based on this dualistic thinking that leads to separation and division. In our global community, there is a growing awareness that we are part of one world community. We have to expand this, our new definition of a human community, in order to include all. One of the core teachings of Buddhism actually emphasizes this total interdependency and interconnectedness of all. When we recognize that they are part of us, and then we feel responsible for everyone else and everything else, thus we are sharing the responsibility to protect them. So we share this one interdependent world, and our institution must be reformed to solve new problems with universally shared values. Every individual and community are connected, and finding new vision and new solution, inviting us to look at deeply in our heart and mind and how we function in the world, expressing this kind of a worldview. And we need to express compassion and love to refugees, to include migrants, and inclusiveness to all minority groups, practicing oneness of humanity and respect dignity for all human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Grace. I think your focus on hate crime and hate speech was most eloquent, particularly when you outlined how that when we hurt others, we hurt ourselves. So maybe all find a new vision. I'd now like to welcome Rabbi Michael Melchior, who's the chairman of the Mosaica Center for Religious Conflict Transformation in the Middle East. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and thank you to all of you. When I woke up this morning at 6 o'clock, I saw the early sun rays from my hotel room over the beautiful hills, and still with some snow and the airplanes flying in. I opened the BBC News, and I heard the coach of the Tottenham Hotspur. I hope you know what I'm talking about. Tottenham Hotspur are playing tonight in the semi-finals of the Champions League. And I heard his message, Pochettino's message to all of the Spurs fans. We have to be willing to dream. And I thought, I see that most of the people here are with one big question mark. It's good. You have to open your eyes to the world of reality. That's football, the world of reality outside. And the Champions League is very important, and it's the first time Tottenham Hotspur are in the semi-finals. And we have to be willing to dream is a good slogan, not only for them, but also for us. In any case, for all the big issues, everybody in this room, in any case, agrees on all the major issues, because that's why you're invited to this conference. And so I don't have to say that, and I don't also have to say what all the obstacles are, because you're all experts in the obstacles. So we don't have to spend time on dealing with the obstacles. So let's talk a little bit about the solutions, and some of you have actually said some excellent things, and I sign on to what most of my predecessors here have spoken, especially my younger Muslim participant here. You can, for my sake, be elected to the chairman of Europe, and I will vote for you for sure. If I had a voting right from Israel, I probably don't have that. But in any case, that would be fine with me. And so I just want to save the few minutes I have a couple of principles which might be controversial, but which might be useful in the work which we're doing in the Middle East, and which have been able to maybe save some thousands of lives, and not only in Israel-Palestine, but also in the further Middle East context, and which are now being used also in Africa, Europe, and other places in the world. First of all, I think that people have to restore belief. There was a feeling of end of history and so on, and now there's a feeling of, especially those who want a better world, a feeling of lack of belief. One very clever Jew many years ago, I'm rephrasing what he said, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, he said, if people trust the capacity of humankind to destroy, they should also be able to trust and believe in the human capacity to build and to rebuild. So we have to restore that belief in humankind. Now, there are a couple of ways, methods to restore that. Some of it was mentioned here. To prove leadership, young leadership, older leadership, women leadership, courage, thinking out of the box, to be convincing, to set up a vision which we don't do, a big vision. Not why not, but why not? Why not is why, all the reasons why not to do things we know, but why not? Why not? To surprise. To surprise, I mentioned once my friend who we created together, the Religious Coalition for Peace in the Middle East, with Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Dawish, may his soul be live in rest. He was the founder not only of the Islamic movement, of Islamic Jihad. And he was in prison for terrorism, and he went deeper into Islam. And he once taught me, when I spoke about anti-Semitism, he said, with all due respect, when you speak about anti-Semitism, you're convincing, but you're not that convincing. When you speak about the hatred against Islam, you're persuasive, you're energetic, you're great. When you speak about anti-Semitism, it's okay, but it's your self-interest. Let's make a deal. I, Sheikh Abdallah, I will speak about anti-Semitism. And he did that over hundreds and thousands of interviews in all of the Arab Muslim world. You will speak about the hatred against Muslims. And that's much more convincing. It's much more surprising. You will show that there's no contradiction between the principles of democracy, human dignity, and the principles of tradition, identity, and national belonging. Because today the young people believe that those are two different things. And you have to be convincing in that, because as long as people believe that those two contradict, there's not going to be peace. And the last point, which I'm forced, unfortunately, because I had a whole long thing which would take 5 hours, but the last point is we have to expand the tent of peace. And in order to do that, you have to work with people you don't like. People are not in this room. And you have to put sometimes some of your beautiful principles aside and just open the tent of peace. You have to work, first of all, for peace. First of all, for life. And then afterwards deal with your ideologies and principles and truth and so on. Don't ever forget them. Don't for 1 minute forget them. But bring everybody inside. And then when they're inside and when you have a working relationship, then you can go back to dealing with all the other issues. You've opened doors. Open the doors, have everybody inside, and show that there is an alternative, that we can rebuild, that there is a hope, that there is a future, and then we can restore the hope for a new generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Melchior. The Rabbi finds inspiration from football. I think that's wonderful. And he's telling us to be willing to dream. We know the obstacles, but we need to find solutions and restore belief in humankind. So next I'd like to invite Dr. Kishin Menasha, who's the Senior Advisor on Freedom of Religion and Belief at the OSCE ODIHR. Thank you, Kishin.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at this very important global summit. And I wanted to build on the Rabbi's comments on football to say that as a Liverpool supporter, I'm also very much hoping and dreaming that they will also come through the semi-final and maybe meet Spurs in the final. That'll be a wonderful dream to turn into reality, but it's not within my power. In the brief time that I have, I thought I would just focus my remarks on one of the themes that has been running through this meeting so far, which is the freedom of religion or belief as an essential aspect in our work to build environments that are open, inclusive, tolerant, cohesive, pluralistic. Why is that important, and why is freedom of religion or belief important? Is because it is quintessentially a human right that is linked to the idea of humanity in all its diversity, in its incredible diversity, a comment that has been made time and time again in this last day and a half. And it's not only FORB is not only an important human rights principle, but it's a instrument for conflict prevention and an invitation to engage in a very deep dialogue on how we build open and inclusive and cohesive societies. So it has great value and a great contribution. That's the first point I want to make. The second point is that nonetheless, many doubt its relevance, many doubt its validity, and many doubt its importance. And we need to take stock of this, and we need to acknowledge it, including within the human rights community. And some of this reflection is quite painful. One point to make in this regard is that we're living in a time when there is a noticeable and significant retreat from universalism into particularism, factionalism, a crisis of identity that pervades all peoples and all societies. So part of the challenge of talking about human rights today is that people are skeptical about them as universal principles. The second point, and FORB is a victim of this, the second point is that we also need to acknowledge, I think, that there are some who use freedom of religion or belief in a tribal and an exclusionary manner as a right for some and not a right for all. And we hear this and we see this very much in Europe today. It's used sometimes by majorities to beat vulnerable minorities. And that includes religious minorities, of course. It includes those who are seeking asylum, migrants, refugees. And the third is another tendency that we fall into as human beings, is to think in very reductionist terms. We are We struggle sometimes with holistic understandings, and we, in relation to FORB, fall into the trap sometimes unwittingly, but sometimes consciously and deliberately, in reducing it, in confining it to that which people do within the four walls of their homes, the private prayer and worship. That is fantastic. But the minute you step out of their home and you dress differently and look differently, I'm sorry, that is just going a bit too far. And so the tendency then to, particularly not familiar or even curious about what motivates individuals at a very fundamental level, is to restrict, because you see it as a threat, as a fear, as something troubling, as worrying. So the tendency to reduce, to fragment, affects freedom of religion or belief. And so people's conviction-based practices, desire to worship together, to be in community with each other, is not given the same protection as belief and conscience. So, in the last minute or so, what can Dialogue 5 actors do as they seek to strive in collaboration to build open, inclusive societies? Number one, I would say, is to systematically and deliberately integrate freedom of religion or belief into this work. But this means to adopt a holistic understanding. This means also to think about the indivisibility of human rights, which are all interdependent, interconnected, mutually reinforcing. We often hear FORB referred to as the first and foremost human right. Well, human rights are interconnected and interdependent. It is no more first and foremost than any other human right. But the point nonetheless is when you restrict a right like FORB, you end up restricting other rights: freedom of association, freedom of expression, women's right to equality. Human rights stand and fall together. We also need to widen the scope of the debate. We need to bring into the discussions around building open and inclusive and tolerant societies grounded in respect for everyone's freedom of religion or belief, actors who are often absent, and they're becoming increasingly noticeable through their absence. We need to widen that scope, and it's important that we do this consciously and deliberately. It's easy to sometimes just think about the religious communities that we know and we see globally, that have a global presence. But I would say they are no more important and relevant than those smaller, less established groups that we don't readily see in our midst, but have credibility because they appeal to people and they make their contribution, and we need to hear from them. And they need to be part of that discussion. We also need to integrate FORB into other discussions which matter to people: climate change, poverty eradication, gender equality, so that we mainstream it across a number of other domains. And the final point, or the last but one point, there's just two closing points, is that while it's important to remember we're discussing universal norms, we need to root this in lived reality and in context. Domestic contexts matter, and in this case, this is very, very important. Sometimes, say this really about myself, we bang on about human rights and FORB to the point that people look at you and just sort of say thank you, but what does that really mean in my context? And that is important, to listen to that and think about FORB as it relates to things that really matter, such as citizenship, coexistence, and frame the discussion sometimes around those terms without losing sight of what we're trying to achieve. And finally, just to repeat what has been said by previous speakers, the role of education. Education, not just for young people, but for all ages, in matters to do with religious literacy, religious and belief diversity. That is fundamental and part of the solution to the problems that are facing our sadly increasingly polarized societies.
Thank you very much, Kishan. You outlined for us how freedom of religion and belief is an essential key in human rights and is linked to humanity in all its diversity, an instrument for conflict prevention and building a cohesive society. I'd now like to welcome Professor Li Guodong, who's chairman of the UCT International Cultural Development Incorporated. Thank you.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. I'm so sorry. I cannot, with English, express my ideology. So my daughter helped me to translation. I use Chinese. 今天的会议对人类的历史具有重大的意义。
Why don't you come up here and you can translate?
Good afternoon, everyone. Today's meeting will be the very important history here. I have 2 points to share with you.
第一，上100年。 世界发生了2次大战。
Go back hundreds years ago, in the world we have big fight, big award. So our human being life is very miserable. Until we have a United Nations.
73年。
Now already 73 years.
没有爆发世界大战。
There's no any war.
这是联合国的伟大的工作。
This is a great job. We need to give big record for United Nations.
给人类缔造了极大的福祉。
So our human being, our world, get a big benefit from United Nations.
但是，局部的战争。 局部国家的战争从来没有停止。
But there's many different places still have a war, never stop.
2000多年来，世界上存在各种宗教，比如基督教。 天主教、伊斯兰教和各个国家的宗教。
2000 years, we have a different religion. Example, Muslim, Buddha, and others.
但是事实证明，所有的宗教虽然都是教人为善学好的。
There's, I believe, all of the religion is teaching us to be good people.
但是战争的局部地区发生，证明人类的心灵还不能平静。
But we can say there still have a word. That means we, in our heart, is not calm down, not peaceful.
这是一个极其严重的问题。
This is very bad and important things we need to take care.
尤其在今天高科技发展的时代，
Especially today,
在高科技发展的时代，
economy is very good now, and science is going to will be very important in this world.
战争可能毁灭的不只是人类，而是整个地球。
So our step is very quick. So I think if like this, if we don't have good heart, we may destroy it in this world. And it's not a small problem.
我们过度的相信发展、繁荣，给我们带来无限的幸福。
If we're doing a lot of things, we believe our life is good and do a lot of economy, science, and we will build a bright future.
但是，不断的发展、不断的繁荣，实际埋下了人类自我毁灭的因素。
Because time is very limited, I got the little green note, so we have to make short. 我们要简短一点 So, 来一个结尾好吗 ？Sorry.
随着科技的发达和繁荣，一方面是改变生活，但是也为人类的毁灭埋下了种子。
我不能翻译，再讲。
因此，为了在地球上能够和谐的存在，
你继续讲 ，finish， 讲完我再翻。
为了让人类在地球上和谐的存在。
Okay, so I will represent Professor Lee to end this speech because the time is limited. So his meaning, one side, we will working hard to promote the economy, promote everything, and even our mobile phone. You know, everybody now we're looking for the mobile phone, but the one side, the mobile phone may damage your eye or may, take a lot of time. So we should balance the world, and we will discuss these important questions later. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. You made some very important points there, and I appreciate your commendation of the work of the United Nations in preventing war. And you're pointing out that because the conflict in the world today is mainly due to our hearts are not in balance, they're not content. So I think that's an important point for us to remember. I'd now like to turn to our challengers, who each have 3 minutes, and we really must stick to it because we have to finish at 1 o'clock. I'm under strict instructions, so please be considerate of one another. I'd like to invite first Dr. Now, I'm not very good at pronunciation, so please correct me. Dr. José Maria Coelho de Portugal, who's the Vice Dean of the International Relations at Law School, Universidad Complutense Madrid. Yes? Okay.
It's perfect, Madam Evan Hills. your pronunciation in Spanish is much better than my pronunciation in English, so perfect. Okay, I will continue. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I do not want to leave, first of all, to thank the International Association for the Defense of Religious Liberty for its amable invitation to participate in this prestigious Congress between all of you. It's a pleasure to work in this European United Nations room among culturally very different people, but all of them men and women of good will. My intervention, like yours, is going to be very short, but not for that with less feeling. And with it, I want just to express a greeting of peace, understanding, and of inclusiveness of all. Our world is getting smaller by the day. Euro-Atlantic relations are becoming ever closer, and European integration is already a fact. In this traditional scenario, new agents such as the Latin American, Asian, and African countries have joined forces. In this new context, the citizenship of all states, thanks to migratory flows, is increasingly global and cosmopolitan. Globalization has given impetus to the transnational integration of citizens, to the creation of culturally open, plural, and diverse societies. And with them, new challenges for religious freedom, such as the need to create a culture of respect and of tolerance. It is therefore necessary to reintroduce religious freedom as a fundamental right to the agenda of the democratic governments to establish systems of protections of this right and to build a culture in which religions are instruments for the defense of peace. Religions are, in our world, at least they should be instruments for peace and not threats to peace. We are instruments for peace and not threats to peace. The new open, democratic, cosmopolitan, diverse and plural societies that we want to build and that are a characteristic of our century mean that today citizens of many cultures live together in the same space. This fact should not be a threat to peace, but an opportunity for harmony. In order to guarantee this harmony, I propose the following measures. First, to build a normative framework that ensures the respect for all creeds. Second, to allow religious freedom to be exercised as a fundamental right. We cannot tolerate that religious freedom is the Cinderella of the fundamental rights. It is a fundamental right as all others, and has to be respected as all others. Third, understand that religious freedom has an irreducible community dimension that must be respected by states. Fourth, to ensure that any direct or indirect discrimination against citizens who practice a religion has to be avoided. Fifth, foster cooperation relations between states and religious confessions, avoiding confusion but guaranteeing cooperation. Sixth, ensuring that citizens have real and effective access to religious services without any discrimination. Seventh, to establish a culture in which religion and religious practice are considered further symptom of healthy social pluralism, even in non-denominational states. Religion is offered, not imposed, and of course it is necessary to build a culture in which religion is one more of the fundamental rights like all others, and in which religious confessions are an instrument for peace and not a threat for peace. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I gather that Dr. Azza Karam is not with us this morning. So I'd like to turn over now to Mr. Ari de Pater from the European Evangelical Alliance, representative at the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, Madam Chair, and organizers of this wonderful conference here in Geneva. I really appreciate the opportunity, and at the same time, I'm a little bit humbled to speak after such eloquent speakers here at the panel. And I just want to underline the contribution of especially Rabbi MELCHIor and Dr. MANOCHA. They made it very, valuable points to the discussion about the importance of tolerance and freedom of religion or belief. Of course, we do appreciate the separation of church and state, and I'm a little bit worried well, I'm not just a little bit, but I'm worried when state and religion are to get too close. At the same time, when we're talking about refugees and asylum applications, sometimes states have to get involved into religious matters. And Dr. Cole-Durham yesterday already mentioned the particular challenges of converts and apostates among the refugees and how states should deal with it. And I can just underline his contributions for that debate and for that topic. As we are here, and of course it's great to have conferences like this, but we are an important part of society ourselves, and we have to be the agents of change ourselves. So we have to stand up against abuses when we feel that our religion or our freedoms are abused to discriminate others and exclude others from the civil public square that we are advocating for. Already 8 years ago, the Os Guinness from the UK, he published the Global Charter of Conscience, and that is exactly advocating for this civil public square where there is a room for all voices in our society, and we need to kind of reinvent the opportunity or the ability to disagree well. We know that we are living in a diverse world, and we want to have that public square rather than to push religion back to the inner room. We want to have that debate in public. I think that is an important thing for us. And also, talking about migrants, it's important to change the narrative. Too often, as we have already concluded before in several contributions, we use religious discourse or religious arguments mainly just for political sake, to foster our own agenda. We have to stand up, and it's not. So we have to stand up against this exclusive narrative. There is a role for all of us to play in our societies. And another important thing for us as well is to shift the focus from statistics to individual stories. Too often in policy debates, you hear a lot about the statistics, and especially in Europe, we want to reduce the number of people coming or staying on our continent. But we have to make sure that that this is about individuals who went through tremendous suffering, and that I hope that will open up the debate in our societies to welcome them and to help them integrate. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. You presented some interesting challenges there. Thank you. And now I'd like to finally turn to Pastor Alberto Guaita. Guaita, okay. President of the Association por la Defensa de la Libertad Religiosa. So thank you. Did I do okay?
Thank you. Excuse me because my language is not English. My second language is French. Then be patient, please. I am pastor, and I have a little personal story because I was part of a minority in my country for many years, all my life. An example. 50, 60 years ago, we could say that in many countries, including Western countries like Spain, religious freedom was only a hope, a desire, but not a reality. The discrimination was practiced directly and without dissimulation. For example, the health foods that came from the United States and were distributed in the Catholic parishes were exclusively destined to the believers, Catholics. but not for Protestants and others. I live this with my parents, like so many other families belonging to religious minorities, and that is not a story or a partial interpretation of history, and not so long ago in Spain, in Europe. Faced with Israel's story, with so many witnesses, I would like to think, and this is only fiction, that in 50 years we could say something like this. 50 years ago, there was still religious intolerance in many countries on this planet, although it seems strange. This has been over for some time. A bad story. Reality, however, is very different. In the last days, weeks, and months, recent attacks with a radical religious sign carried out by violent minorities have spilled blood and hate in different scenarios. It is in news, in television, newspaper, on social networks, everywhere. The reality of today, after so many years of talking, writing, discussing seminars, international meetings like this one, so many countries subscribing to fundamental human rights but not respecting them, in the first place, religious freedom or believing or not, but respecting all people, continues without being a reality. I believe that there are some essential aspects that we have not been able to apply in the laws and the basic cultural concepts of our modern society of the 21st century. There are still too many countries or too many governments that are not capable of separating the church, any religion, and the state, since there are still many civil laws that are confused with religious ones, which show that these two concepts, these two mixed realities, continue to be present in the name of traditions and culture, which in practice deny fundamental rights such as the right to religious freedom, the freedom to choose a new religion or to renounce it. I need to finish with the question of time, but let me say two ideas. The first thing to make a bridge is the title of our convention. For to build a bridge, it's necessary pillars, foundations, good foundations. And these good foundations are only education and laws. Education from child, young people, all the society. Education in school, in home, in center of worship, in church, in mosque, in synagogue. In all these parts, we need education for the tolerance. That is the pillar fundamental for a bridge. Laws. All the laws in all countries should to be submitted to the human rights. And the countries that not are disposed to submit their laws to the rights, human rights, anything it's necessary to make, any necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very sorry. I have to draw us to a close. Unfortunately, there's not time for questions. We have to leave here at 1 o'clock. And I've been asked to let everyone know that we will have a lunch break now, and we're expected to be back by 14:50 or 10 minutes to 3 o'clock. Could I ask Mr. Diang to make any final comment he'd like to make, and then we'll all go to lunch.
Just to wish
each and all of you a very good appetite, enjoy your right to food. But I will simply say that we have had, I think, a rich presentation. It's just too bad that we could not have time to interact with the various panelists. But if I had to take really something with me for lunch as my appetizer, that will be what Abu Nimer said from the beginning. The need to provide tools for and supporting advocacy for the protection of minorities. I was recently in Italy, and I was so pleased to see many groups of people from the civil society who are taking time, who are developing energy, just as to provide that protection which is needed. But at the same time, I had also a concern, which is the silence around the treatment of those minorities, refugees, migrants. I mean, even while we are attacking, let's say, the ultra-nationalists, the extreme right wing, those so-called left wing are also not really speaking out. You know, there is a kind of opportunism which we feel also on that side. And that's why, as he said, it is very important that we take a clear stand against, you know, those voices who call for purity, you know, who think that the presence of this migrant and others is something which is tainting on their identity, on their purity. And this is totally wrong. We are seeing a rise of anti-Semitism, particularly in this part of the world, in Europe. We are seeing the migrant, the refugees who are being humiliated, who are being dehumanized. And we are even hearing in some places leaders saying, well, it is the fault of the migrant, of the refugees, if our economy is now falling down. And this should remind us the discourse in the 30s, when the Jews were being used as a scapegoat, saying they are the one who are. So that's why I think it is very important that we continue to find a way. I mean, people have spoken about education, but we could have time to discuss really what is needed. Which education are we talking about? Time has come certainly to think about a transformative education. You know, how can we make sure that things change? Because we are living a new world. There is a new, I would say, the future of education and the education for future. We need to reflect on that. And with this, bon appetit, and see you at 3 o'clock.